Book 9 of 2020 was Flowers for Algernon by Daniel Keyes. So this is the second time of me reading this book because it was nominated for book club, and you can check my other review of it from last time on my first reading of it. I was actually really surprised that I enjoyed it a second time round, because I don't tend to like books the second time of reading, because I tend to kind of not get out of them what I got out of them the first time. Like, I always think that like you get different things out of books depending on what time of your life and what headspace that you're in. And so I was quite like glad, if you will, that when I read it again I still liked it, because it's a book that I really resonate with and really kind of got a lot out of. It's really good. Basically, Charlie is, they refer to it as kind of like mentally retarded, and he gets approached by some scientists who are trying to make people more intelligent. Like, they've tried it on a mouse, which is Algernon, that's where the name comes from, and it's worked and he's become, you know, more intelligent, and they want to trial it on a human being. So obviously they want to try it on somebody that's got below average intelligence so that they can see whether or not that'll improve. What's really, really interesting is that the way that this book's framed is Charlie writes progress reports. So he's writing down his experiences, and you can see like the progression and the change over time in his intelligence level. And it follows the course of what we know about how we develop through psychology. So it's really well done. And also the kind of spelling and grammar is also improved in the way that we learn to write, which it was interesting for me because I'm a teacher, so I see, and I've taught at like different levels. So I've taught like people that come to me at like 16 who've come from school whose writing's quite poor, and then they stay with me for 2 years and then it gets better. And then I've also now I taught adults as well, and then I'd also now taught people at university, and you can see like how their writing develops as well. So it was really, really interesting that Keyes kind of followed that trajectory of how language develops, and you know how you the things that you always see students get wrong, he did in the way that it gets corrected. Like, you know, the more experience you get and the better that you get at writing, you correct certain things. So I liked the way that he was very observant about that, or had done a lot of research about that perhaps. And the psychology of it as well. Like, there's some interesting things like theory of mind is the ability to understand other people's perspectives and points of view and what they're thinking, and to understand that they might not be telling the truth, and that they might be acting in ways that go against what they actually say. And you kind of develop that at the age of 7 or around that time. But obviously people with autism and things are delayed in that, and other people with developmental disorders. So for example, Charlie's mentally retarded didn't have that before, and he gets that perspective as he becomes more intelligent, and quite early on as well, which I liked, because Keyes is basically saying, you know, essentially Charlie goes through the developmental stages of a child and then, you know, becomes an adult. And it's interesting as well because like at teenage years, that's about the time when you've become so intelligent, but your emotional intelligence hasn't caught up, and you haven't got that emotional experience. And you're particularly at a disadvantage if you haven't got anyone that's around you that is good at articulating their emotions. So you kind of need to be around people that are able to recognise how they're feeling and to communicate that to you, to allow you to communicate how you're feeling. If you didn't have that as a child, it obviously gets delayed until you're an adult and you're around people that can actually do it. And it was interesting because obviously that's what Charlie's going through. He's kind of learning how to relate to other people. He's learning how to not, you know, I think when you are younger, you kind of are very blunt, and you kind of just say what you think, and you don't really think about the impact of what that might have on other people. But obviously as you get older, you start to realise, I can't say what I want to say in the way that I want to say it, because that's going to have a consequence on that other person. They're going to feel bad or whatever. So you have to kind of like wrap it up in bows. Like, you've got to kind of like be nice and put some fluff on it so that people don't get offended with what you say. And you know, I still struggle with that because that's part of my personality, but you know, that's something that you learn when you become emotionally aware. And I think Charlie goes through that as well. Like, he starts to realise as well that all these people that he'd held in high esteem, so for example the people that he was around in the bakery, he esteemed them all. And then as he was getting more intelligent, he realised that actually they were really quite unintelligent themselves, and that they didn't really, you know, achieve much in life or anything like that. And he became more intelligent, and then he was quite admirable of the students when they were talking about, you know, different topics. And then he got a bit more intelligent and realised that university students like have quite banal conversations about things, and that they don't actually know that much about them, but they just like to, you know, pretend like they're clever kind of thing. And obviously as you get more intelligent, you realise that university students aren't that intelligent. And then he kind of gets more intelligent where he realises that the lecturers aren't that intelligent, which is again another thing that people realise once they get up to that level of intelligence, is that just because somebody is a lecturer in something doesn't necessarily mean that they're overall intelligent at things. They're just very good at this thing that they've studied for many years. And so he kind of gets really frustrated because he realises that these people that he'd revered and that he'd thought were very intelligent and had all the answers didn't have any of the answers. And it's quite interesting actually, because I've been watching The Crown. I just finished the whole kind of 3 series because it was so good. And there's an episode where Prince Philip wants to meet the 3 astronauts that had gone up to the moon. So, you know, Buzz Aldrin, is that his name? And Neil Armstrong, and the other one that I can never remember, that nobody else ever remembers either. He wanted to meet them because he wanted to ask them some quite kind of spiritual questions and some kind of like, you know, what's the kind of like purpose of life kind of questions. And when he met them, he realised that although they'd done this amazing thing, they were just men. They were just normal people who actually were quite, you know, I mean, the way the crowd portrayed them was that they were quite kind of immature, and they didn't really have any, you know, they weren't wise in any way at all. You know, spiritually, they didn't know very much. They just knew about how to be an astronaut. And they actually had the same perspective of Prince Philip. They thought that, you know, he knew lots of things because he lived in a palace and all this kind of stuff. So it was really interesting that, you know, we always have this perception that other people know more than us, or kind of are more wise than us, or are kind of, I don't know, like more intelligent than us, I guess. But they're not. Like, they're really not. Like, obviously some people are more intelligent, obviously, but just because of what people do, that doesn't mean that they're intelligent. Like, just because of the things that they've achieved or because of the posts that they hold doesn't mean that they have all the answers to everything and that you don't have anything to offer, like you actually do. So I found that quite interesting, because that was a frustration that I had growing up, was that a lot of the people that were teaching me, I could recognise that they weren't actually that intelligent, and that the way that they were teaching was quite like not as good as what it could be, and that really frustrated me. But then that made me behave how Charlie behaved, which was in a quite arrogant and a quite like not very nice way, because you've got to accept that just because someone's teaching you doesn't mean they have all the answers. So I kind of really resonated with that. And as well, Charlie finds it really difficult because he falls in love with somebody because obviously he thinks that she's amazing initially, and as he becomes older and wiser and kind of, you know, more developed, he kind of realises that she can't fulfill like his needs, like that he has these needs that to like connect with somebody on the same kind of intellectual level, and he can't do that with her. And she becomes quite kind of banal and really uninteresting. And it's interesting to me because that has actually happened to me before, and it sounds bad to say it, but I think this is why Keyes is such a good kind of observer of human behaviour, because, you know, we talked about this at book club and not a lot of people kind of were on my wavelength about this, and I imagine it's because they've maybe not experienced it themselves, or they were not like willing to admit it. But I'd been in relationships with people and initially found them interesting, but then when I kind of developed more across time and became more interested in things that they just didn't have the ability to grasp and understand, you kind of hit a brick wall because you can't express quite a lot of yourself because they don't understand it. And, you know, it's similar kind of like with relationships with like family and things like that. Like, if a lot of what you enjoy talking about and engaging with they reject because they don't understand it, it's very difficult to kind of have a relationship, because, you know, what do you talk about? You know, because you have different interests, because you've kind of gone down a different path, if you will. So I thought that was kind of really interesting that was, you know, approached in the story. And obviously all these things are quite like philosophical as well, and Keyes doesn't do it kind of overtly, it's kind of all implied throughout, and so I think you've got to kind of pick up on it yourself, I guess. And it, you know, the characters in it, they're quite authentic. You find out quite a bit about the characters, and you kind of find out about how they interact with each other, and you get a kind of feel for who they are as people quite quickly. So I thought that was, you know, it's quite good characterisation by Keyes. And the other thing that he touches on as well is that a lot of our kind of understandings of situations are based on our interpretations of those situations, and so they can be very biased. Like, you know, how you perceive a person saying something could be remembered in a different way to the way it was intended. So, you know, you might experience somebody being quite rude to you, but they might not have actually intended it to be rude, and so you then remember them as rude, but actually that was never what, you know, the intention was, and that's kind of like a biased interpretation of that, you know, what that person was discussing or whatever. And so that kind of affects the narrative of your life, and, you know, it might be that you kind of interpret people as being quite hostile, or I don't know. I mean, Charlie's quite, like, people are taking the mick out of him constantly and putting him down constantly, but because he doesn't have that intellectual understanding, he thinks that they're his friends, and that he thinks that, you know, that they like him, and they just don't. You know, somebody who's constantly putting you down and constantly poking fun of you is not on your side. They don't like you. Like, that's not a good relationship to be in, and Charlie recognises that as he becomes more intelligent. But what he does say is that I think there was some times where he'd actually interpreted it in his mind in a bad way, but it actually wasn't. So he had memories in his mind of things that had happened that he began to remember, because that's another thing that developed his memory as he got more intelligent. And so particularly, like, his relationship with his sister, like, he remembered his sister in a really bad way, but when he met his sister, she was quite happy to see him. So it kind of like affects your life because of the stories that you keep telling yourself. And it's interesting because there's a lot of psychologists that, you know, in books I've read from Dorothy Rowe, for example, that says that we follow the scripts, we follow kind of the stories that we tell ourselves, and so we need to kind of recognise that they're stories and to try and rewrite those and think of them in different ways. And so I love the book. It's great. You know, I gave it a 4 stars. I mean, I think what would probably improve it was if it was a little bit more, I guess, in detail in terms of the characterisation. I feel like it could have gone a little bit deeper, but I don't think it's really got the scope to be able to do that. And obviously the plot's quite, like, yeah, it's not like massively, it's not like, oh my god, I've got to keep like reading, I've got to find out, it's shocking or anything. It's kind of lacking that, which is why it's not a 5. But yeah, definitely a 4 stars. I definitely recommend it to anybody to read, because I really enjoyed it, and it was a hit at the book club as well, like a lot of people liked it.